It was a cold, quiet night when Sarah pulled her car into the gas station. The headlights of her old sedan cut through the darkness, and the hum of the neon lights overhead seemed to echo in the stillness of the empty lot. Most of the town had turned in for the night. There were only a few cars scattered around the station, and the air felt heavier, more suffocating than usual. Sarah had just finished a long day of work and was on her way home. Her mind was tired, replaying the events of the day, but her body welcomed the short break. She rolled down her window, the crisp night air biting at her skin. The rhythmic sound of the gas pump as it clicked away was almost soothing as she filled her car. Her routine was about to change. As Sarah glanced around, she noticed a dark sedan pull up beside her. The car's windows were heavily tinted, and for a moment she thought nothing of it. But there was something about the way the car parked, slightly out of place, that made her uneasy. The driver didn't get out, which was odd. Most customers went inside to grab snacks or use the restroom. But Sarah didn't think too much of it, until she heard the conversation. It started softly, just faint whispers she couldn't quite catch. She hesitated, looking over toward the sedan, but it wasn't until she heard a few more words that her curiosity got the best of her. She wasn't sure if it was the quietness of the night or the unsettling feeling in her gut, but she couldn't ignore it. "We can't afford a mistake. Time is running out." The words sent a chill down her spine. Sarah quickly looked back down at the gas pump, trying not to draw attention to herself. The conversation was definitely about something serious, and judging by the tension in their voices, it wasn't a casual chat. She was about to ignore it, until she heard one final chilling sentence. "We need to finish this tonight." Her heart skipped a beat. Who were they talking about? What were they planning? The weight of the words hung in the air long after they faded, but Sarah couldn't shake the sense of dread that crept in. She finished filling her tank in a hurry, her hands trembling slightly. The gas station seemed quieter than usual, and the silence felt oppressive. As Sarah stepped back into her car, her eyes flicked nervously toward the sedan. The car doors creaked open and two men in dark coats stepped out. They didn't look at her. Instead, they hurried into the convenience store, barely acknowledging the world around them. Sarah quickly started her engine, the car's motor humming to life. She wasn't sure why, but she felt an overwhelming urge to leave. There was something about those men, something she couldn't quite put her finger on, that made her feel uneasy. She wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but she knew what she had overheard wasn't normal. Whatever they were talking about wasn't just a casual conversation. As she drove away, Sarah glanced in her rearview mirror. The dark sedan was still parked at the station, its lights off. She couldn't see the men, but she had an overwhelming feeling that the whole thing was far from over. It was just a whisper of an idea at first, a nagging suspicion. But the more Sarah thought about it, the more she couldn't shake the feeling that something big was unfolding right under her nose. The next day, Sarah found herself replaying the conversation in her mind. The words they had spoken, the tone in their voices, all of it felt wrong. It didn't sit well with her. She knew she hadn't imagined the urgency. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't something she could ignore. But Sarah wasn't a detective. She wasn't trained to investigate or dive into dangerous situations. What could she do? Was she being paranoid, or was there something more to it? The nagging feeling in her gut told her this wasn't something she could just brush off. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that something was happening in her quiet town. Something hidden beneath the surface, and those two men might hold the answers. A week went by and Sarah couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time she passed the gas station on her way home, she would slow down, scanning the parking lot for the dark sedan. But it never showed up. The gas station seemed like any other, with no sign of anything out of the ordinary. Still, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then one night, as Sarah approached the gas station again, there it was. The dark sedan parked in the exact same spot. This time it was late, close to midnight, and the station was almost empty. A few cars scattered in the parking lot, but no one seemed to be around. Sarah slowed down, her curiosity burning. She parked her car at the far end of the lot and watched. The sedan sat motionless, its lights dimmed. Sarah couldn't make out any movement inside, but she knew she had to find out what was going on. There was no more pretending. This had gone from a simple overheard conversation to something much bigger. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't sure what she was going to do, but she knew she couldn't just leave again. Slowly, she climbed out of her car and walked toward the convenience store entrance, pretending to be like any other late-night customer. But inside, her nerves were buzzing. Her eyes kept drifting toward the sedan. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours as Sarah waited. She pretended to browse the shelves, but her mind was racing. Just as she was about to turn to leave, the door to the sedan opened and two men emerged. Her breath caught in her throat. They weren't the same men as before. These two were younger, their faces familiar but not from the gas station. They glanced around, their expressions tense, before entering the store. Sarah stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. But then she heard it, another whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Make sure no one sees us leave," one of the men said to the other. Her heart pounded. Something was happening, something she couldn't ignore. She had to act fast. But as she moved to get closer, she heard the unmistakable sound of a car engine revving up behind her. Sarah turned, only to see a dark shadow racing toward her, the headlights blinding her for a moment. A voice cut through the tension. "Hey, are you looking for something?" The voice was unfamiliar, but it had an edge to it, a dangerous edge. And then it hit her. Someone was watching her. The blood drained from Sarah's face. She realized in that instant that this wasn't just a random encounter. She was in deeper than she had ever imagined. Sarah's heart raced as the engine revved behind her. The headlights of the approaching vehicle cut through the dark, blinding her for a moment. She turned slowly, trying to appear calm despite the knot of dread tightening in her chest. The stranger in the car was too close, and his words hung in the air like a warning. "Hey, are you looking for something?" Sarah felt her stomach twist. She hadn't expected to be confronted so suddenly. The man's voice was calm, but there was something in his tone that made her uneasy. He wasn't asking out of curiosity, he was sizing her up, assessing whether she was a threat or someone who could be dealt with quickly. For a moment, Sarah considered ignoring him, walking away and getting back to her car. But something inside her told her to stay alert. The last thing she needed was to be caught off guard by this stranger, who seemed to know more about what was happening than he was letting on. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to look the man in the eye. His face was partially shadowed, but his expression was unreadable. He leaned slightly out of the window, his gaze never leaving her. "No, just browsing," Sarah replied, her voice steady but betraying a hint of uncertainty. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." The stranger didn't respond immediately. Instead, he shifted his gaze over her shoulder, as if inspecting the area behind her. The silence between them stretched on, long enough for Sarah to feel a wave of unease wash over her. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Then, almost casually, the man spoke again, his words cutting through the tension. "You should be careful," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Things aren't what they seem around here." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Was he threatening her? Or was he warning her about something she didn't understand? The truth was she couldn't be sure, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. She wanted to ask him what he meant, to demand answers, but something told her that pressing him further might make the situation worse. The last thing she wanted was to make herself a target. So, instead, she nodded slowly, trying to look as if she was unaffected by his cryptic words. "Thanks," she said, forcing a small smile. "I'll keep that in mind." Without another word, the man slowly rolled his window up, his eyes still locked on hers for a beat longer. Then, without warning, he slammed his foot on the gas, and the car sped off into the night, disappearing into the dark streets beyond the gas station. Sarah stood frozen for a few moments, her mind racing. What had just happened? Who was that man? And why did he seem so certain that something was wrong? A part of her wanted to run back to her car and leave, but another part, one that had been nagging her since she overheard the conversation in the dark sedan, couldn't let it go. The feeling in her gut told her that something was wrong, that she was closer to uncovering something important, something dangerous. And no matter how scared she felt, she couldn't back down now. With a deep breath, Sarah turned her attention back to the gas station. The sedan she had seen earlier was still parked in the same spot, but there was no sign of the two men she had noticed before. She glanced at the convenience store, then at the parking lot. It was quieter now, almost eerily so. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something she was meant to witness. As much as she wanted to turn away and forget the whole thing, she knew she couldn't. Not now. Not after everything she had overheard. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled her phone from her purse. She quickly typed a message to her friend, Megan, letting her know she was going to stay at the gas station a little longer, that she had a bad feeling and didn't want to be alone. Megan quickly responded, asking if everything was okay. Sarah hesitated before replying, telling her that she wasn't sure but would let her know soon. Sarah looked around the station again. There were a few other cars scattered around, but no one seemed to be paying attention to the strange events unfolding. She needed answers, and she needed them now. As she stood there, lost in thought, Sarah suddenly heard footsteps behind her. She spun around, her heart pounding, but no one was there. She looked left and right, her senses heightened. Was she imagining things? She couldn't afford to let her guard down now, especially after that encounter with the stranger. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure moving in the shadows, heading toward the back of the gas station. She couldn't make out who it was, but the way the person moved, it wasn't casual. It was purposeful, like they were trying to avoid being seen. Her instincts screamed at her to follow, but her mind wavered. Could she really risk it? What if she was walking into something dangerous? But there was no turning back now. She had already heard enough to know that something wasn't right at this gas station. There was a connection to the men in the sedan, and she had a feeling it wasn't just a coincidence. They were hiding something big, and she needed to find out what it was. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped cautiously toward the back of the building, her footsteps soft against the gravel. As she moved further into the darkness, her eyes scanned the shadows, looking for any sign of the mysterious figure. She was nearly to the back door of the gas station when she heard a faint noise, a soft, metallic clink, coming from behind the building. Her pulse quickened. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for. She was so close to finding out the truth. She pushed the door open slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The air was cold and smelled faintly of oil and rubber. She could barely see in the dim light, but her eyes adjusted enough to make out shapes in the distance. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. "What are you doing here?" Sarah froze. She didn't recognize the voice, but it was close, too close. She turned slowly, her heart racing. Standing in front of her was a man, his face hidden in shadow. And as he stepped forward, a feeling of dread settled deep in Sarah's bones. As the man stepped closer, his figure emerging from the shadows. She could barely make out his features, but the cold, hard edge of his voice told her all she needed to know. He wasn't someone to be trifled with. "What are you doing here?" he repeated, his tone sharp and demanding. The weight of his words felt suffocating, like they were meant to warn her, to make her back off before things escalated. Sarah instinctively took a step back, her mind scrambling for a way out of this. The back of the gas station was completely isolated from the rest of the lot, and no one else was around. She had no idea who this man was, but her gut told her that this wasn't a random encounter. This was serious. She forced herself to stay calm, but the fear bubbling beneath the surface threatened to take over. I'm just here to get some air," she said, her voice wavering only slightly. It sounded weak even to her ears, but it was all she could manage in that moment. The man's eyes narrowed, and for a split second, Sarah thought she saw a flicker of recognition in his gaze. It was brief, but it was enough to send a shiver down her spine. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice now lower, more dangerous. "Go back inside now." Sarah didn't move. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information that had been haunting her since she first overheard that conversation at the gas station. She had been right to stay, there was something bigger at play here, something she couldn't ignore. But she couldn't just walk away. Not now. Not when she was so close. "I heard something," Sarah said, taking a deep breath. "I overheard a conversation and it didn't sit right with me. What's going on here? What are you hiding?" The man's expression didn't change, but his posture stiffened. His eyes flicked briefly to the back door of the gas station, then back to her. It was clear that he was weighing his options, trying to decide whether to let her go or silence her. "You don't want to know," he finally said, his voice colder than before. "Trust me. It's better for everyone if you just leave." The words were chilling and the warning was obvious. This man was not afraid to do whatever it took to protect whatever secrets were hidden here. But Sarah couldn't back down. She had already come too far, and she wasn't about to walk away now. Not when everything was on the line. "What are you hiding?" Sarah repeated, this time more forcefully. "I won't leave until you tell me." The man's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might lunge at her, might try to shut her up by force. But instead he stepped back, his eyes scanning the parking lot, making sure no one else was watching. "You have no idea what you're getting into," he muttered, almost to himself. "This is bigger than you think. You're playing with fire." Sarah didn't back down. She wasn't going to be intimidated, not now. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady. "Who's behind all of this? I need answers." The man looked at her for a long moment, his face hard as stone. Finally, he sighed, almost as if he had resigned himself to the inevitable. He took another step back, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "My name's Eric," he said quietly. "I can't tell you everything, but you're in way over your head. This is dangerous. The people involved in this, They don't care about who they hurt to protect their secrets. You need to leave. You need to forget you ever saw anything. Sarah's mind spun as she processed his words. He was telling her to leave. But why? Was he trying to protect her, or was he trying to intimidate her into silence? She wasn't sure, but one thing was clear: there was something much bigger happening here. She could feel it in her bones. And despite the fear gnawing at her insides, she knew she couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. Who's behind all of this? She asked again, her voice more insistent. Who are these people? What are they doing? Eric hesitated, looking around again as if checking for someone. Then he leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. They're not just local criminals, he said, his voice tight with anxiety. They're connected. Bigger than anything you can imagine. They've got influence everywhere: police, politics, businesses. If you keep digging, they'll come after you. You won't be safe. Sarah's heart raced. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Whatever was going on here wasn't just a small-time operation. It was much larger than that, and the stakes were higher than she could have imagined. Eric paused for a moment, his face tense. You need to stop now. You're already in too deep. Before Sarah could respond, she heard a sound, a car door slamming shut in the distance. She turned her head instinctively, but by the time she looked back, Eric was gone. He had vanished into the night, leaving Sarah alone and more confused than ever. The sound of footsteps echoed from behind her, and Sarah whipped around, her heart hammering in her chest. Was it Eric returning? Or was it someone else? In the dim light, she could make out two figures emerging from the shadows. They moved quickly, almost as if they had been waiting for the right moment. The sight of them sent a chill down her spine. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but her curiosity, and her need for answers, kept her rooted to the spot. The two men came closer, their faces hidden in the darkness. One of them spoke, his voice low and menacing. You shouldn't have stuck your nose where it doesn't belong, the man said, his words dripping with threat. Now you're going to regret it. Sarah's pulse quickened as the men advanced, and in that moment she realized the situation was even more dangerous than she had feared. She was surrounded. There was no way out. But then, just as quickly as they had approached, the men stopped. Their heads snapped toward something behind her, their expressions shifting from threatening to something else, something darker. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she turned to follow their gaze. The gas station was no longer empty. A car had pulled up, its headlights blinding her for a moment. The engine cut off, and a figure stepped out of the vehicle, silhouetted against the bright light. Her eyes widened in recognition. It was Eric. But this time he wasn't alone. The air grew thicker, heavier, as Sarah stood frozen, her eyes locked on Eric. The man she had just spoken to, the one who had warned her to back off, was now standing before her once again. But this time he wasn't alone. There were others with him, shadows that moved in sync, their faces obscured by the dim light of the gas station's harsh floodlights. The men who had approached her moments before seemed to hesitate, their demeanor shifting. The moment they recognized Eric, the tension in the air became palpable. Sarah could feel the chill of uncertainty creeping up her spine. Who was Eric really? And why was he suddenly appearing with these men? Her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to ask him why he had left her alone in the first place, why he had disappeared so abruptly, but the words caught in her throat. The situation had spiraled far beyond her expectations. Eric glanced over at the men briefly before turning his gaze back to Sarah. His face was hard, the usual weariness replaced by something colder, something more guarded. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the quiet of the night, it felt like it echoed. I told you to leave, Sarah, Eric said, his voice filled with quiet urgency. You should have listened. This is much bigger than you think. There's no turning back now. Sarah's mind raced. Was he warning her for her own safety? Or was this just another attempt to keep her in the dark? One of the men, taller and broader than the others, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he scanned Sarah. There was a coldness in his gaze, one that sent a chill crawling across her skin. He wasn't interested in talking. He was interested in something else, something more dangerous. I think it's time for you to go, miss, the man said, his voice calm but laced with an underlying threat. Before things get uncomfortable. Sarah's pulse quickened. Every part of her screamed at her to run, to get away from these men and whatever dark dealings they were wrapped up in. But her curiosity, her need to uncover the truth, held her in place. She wasn't going to back down now. She had already come too far. Why? Sarah demanded, her voice shaking but defiant. "Why are you doing this? What are you hiding?" The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "You don't get to ask questions," he said, his tone colder than before. "You don't belong here. This is none of your business." Eric stepped forward, his hand raised, signaling the men to step back. The tension in the air only intensified as he looked Sarah in the eyes. "Please just go," Eric said quietly. "I don't want to see you hurt." Sarah's mind was in turmoil. What was happening? She had heard enough to know that something criminal was going on, but what were they really hiding? And why had Eric gone from trying to warn her to standing in front of her like this? But just as Sarah was about to respond, another sound broke through the tension. Another car approaching, its headlights cutting through the darkness. A sedan slid to a stop in front of the gas station, its engine idling. The atmosphere shifted again, the air thickening with the weight of what was to come. The man who had been speaking to Sarah turned his head sharply at the sound, his eyes narrowing in recognition. Without another word, he stepped back into the shadows, his face now unreadable. Eric didn't seem to notice the car. His attention remained fixed on Sarah, his expression unreadable, but his lips pressed into a firm line, as though he were silently debating something. "Just go, Sarah," he repeated, his voice quieter this time, almost pleading. "It's not safe for you. There's more going on than you realize." Sarah's mind raced. She wasn't sure what to do, leave and pretend she hadn't heard or seen anything, or stay and risk uncovering something that could change everything. But as the car's door opened and someone stepped out, Sarah's attention snapped toward the newcomer. The figure that emerged from the sedan was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a dark suit. Their face was obscured by the shadows, but their posture screamed authority. Whoever this person was, they weren't just any ordinary person. Eric's face grew even darker, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. "This is it," Eric muttered under his breath, barely audible. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." The man in the suit walked toward them, his presence commanding, his every movement deliberate. As he approached, Sarah could see that his face was older, roughened by years of experience. Someone who had seen things, done things. His eyes locked onto Sarah, and a knowing glint flickered there. "So this is the one who's been asking too many questions," the man in the suit said, his voice smooth and confident. "I should have known." Eric stepped forward, blocking Sarah from the man's gaze. "No, she doesn't know anything. She's just—" "She knows more than you think," the suited man interrupted, his voice cutting through Eric's protests. "And now she's too far involved. There's no way to stop this now." Sarah's heart raced in her chest as the man's words sank in. What did he mean? She hadn't even scratched the surface of what was going on, had she? She still didn't have all the answers, far from it. But now it seemed like there was no turning back. The suited man turned his gaze to her, his expression darkening. "You've made a mistake asking questions. You've stirred things up that shouldn't be stirred." Eric's voice cracked, his usually calm demeanor breaking for a moment. "Please, just let her go." The suited man's lips curled into a faint, cruel smile. "She's already too deep, Eric. The question now is, what happens next?" A tense silence fell over the group. Sarah stood there, caught in the middle of something much larger than herself, unsure of where to turn. She knew she couldn't leave without understanding what was happening, but she also understood that the moment she asked more questions, she was putting herself in danger. Just as the suited man took a step closer, Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out quickly, her eyes scanning the screen. It was a message from Megan. "Are you okay? What's going on? Let me know if you need help." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for, the last chance to make a choice. She turned back to Eric, her voice barely a whisper. "What do I do now?" But before Eric could answer, the suited man reached out, grabbing Sarah's arm in a swift motion. "You should have stayed out of this," he said, his grip tightening. And just as Sarah opened her mouth to speak, something in the distance caught her eye, a flicker of movement. Her heart skipped a beat. A new figure had appeared, and this one was different. This person wasn't here by accident. They were here for a reason. And they weren't alone. The grip on Sarah's arm tightened, pulling her further into the shadows. The suited man's face was inches from hers now, his breath cold against her skin as his eyes bore into hers with an intensity that made her stomach churn. But before she could react, the distant figure, the one she had seen moving in the darkness, stepped forward. Was a woman. The newcomer's presence was commanding. There was something about the way she moved that felt deliberate and sharp, like she wasn't just a bystander. No, this woman was involved in whatever dark web Sarah had unknowingly stumbled into. Let her go, Marcus, the woman's voice rang out, cutting through the tension in the air. Her words were firm, calm, and dangerously assured. She's not your problem. The suited man, Marcus, turned slightly toward her, his eyes narrowing. The tension between them was palpable. Sarah could sense there was history between the two of them, something she didn't fully understand but could feel in the way they communicated without words. You're stepping out of line, Claire, Marcus growled, his hand still gripping Sarah's arm. You don't get to decide what happens here. Claire's eyes shifted briefly toward Sarah before returning to Marcus. I'm not here for this. Let her go. It's over. For a long moment Marcus didn't move. The silence between them felt like it stretched on forever, each second thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Sarah felt her pulse race. She was in the middle of something she hadn't been prepared for, but now there was no going back. I don't think you understand, Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. She's seen too much. Not anymore, Claire said simply, her voice unwavering. Sarah's mind was spinning. Was this woman trying to help her? Was this her chance to finally escape whatever nightmare she had found herself in? Before she could process any more thoughts, Marcus made a swift decision. He shoved Sarah toward Claire, his grip finally releasing her arm. Get out of my way, Claire, he spat, his face twisted in anger. This is your last warning. But Claire didn't budge. Instead, she stepped forward, blocking Marcus's path. The tension in the air thickened, and Sarah could feel the electricity of the confrontation hanging between them. Marcus looked like he was about to lash out, but then, just as quickly as the conflict had built, something shifted. The sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder by the second. Both Claire and Marcus froze, their eyes flicking toward the road, where the flashing red and blue lights could now be seen. The sirens grew louder, unmistakable. They're coming, Marcus muttered under his breath, a mixture of irritation and panic creeping into his voice. Claire didn't look worried. Instead, her gaze remained fixed on him, a knowing look passing between them. You've lost, she said, her voice full of quiet finality. You can't cover it up anymore. For the first time, Sarah saw a crack in Marcus's confident exterior. His eyes flicked toward the approaching lights, then back to Claire, his jaw clenched in frustration. I didn't do this, he said, almost as though he was speaking to himself. I didn't, but I'm not the one in charge anymore. You think you can stop this now? Claire didn't respond immediately. She simply turned her back to him, stepping closer to Sarah, her eyes softening for the first time. Are you okay? Claire asked, her voice unexpectedly kind, like a lifeline in the chaos. Sarah, still reeling from the whirlwind of events, nodded slowly. I'm fine. I think. The sirens were nearly deafening now, and Marcus glanced once more toward the road, his expression hardening. You think you've won but you haven't, he said, the anger returning to his voice. It's already too late. You can't stop what's coming. Claire's expression hardened as she took a step forward, standing in front of Sarah protectively. We'll see about that. The sound of police cars skidding to a stop just outside the gas station filled the air. Within moments, officers were rushing toward them, their movements swift and practiced, like they had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Marcus didn't hesitate. With one last glance at Claire, his eyes narrowed, and he turned to sprint into the shadows, disappearing into the night as quickly as he had arrived. Sarah stood frozen, her mind still processing what had just happened. Claire remained beside her, the police now swarming around the gas station, flashing their lights and setting up a perimeter. Are you with them? Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. She wasn't sure who to trust anymore, not after everything that had unfolded. Claire gave a small, reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Not exactly. But I'm not against you either. The police quickly rounded up the remaining men who had been standing in the shadows, but Sarah barely noticed them as she tried to make sense of everything. What had she stumbled into? What did all of this mean? Claire glanced at her and then back toward the officers. We should go, she said softly. The sound of a voice behind them caught Sarah's attention. She turned around to see a police officer walking toward them. He was older, his expression serious but not unfriendly. Miss, are you okay? He asked, his tone gentle but firm. We're going to need your statement. We've been tracking some serious criminal activity here, and your involvement is key. Sarah nodded slowly, still feeling disoriented. She was exhausted, mentally and physically. But something in her kept pushing her forward. There was more to this than she understood, and she wasn't about to walk away from it now. "I need answers," she said, her voice steady despite the confusion. "What's really going on here?" The officer's expression softened, but he didn't immediately answer. Instead, he exchanged a look with Claire, as if silently debating something. Finally he sighed and spoke. "There's a lot more to this than we can explain right now. But you were right to trust your instincts. We'll fill you in soon, but for now, just know that you're safe." As the police began to secure the area, Claire led Sarah away from the station, her hand gently guiding her through the crowd of officers. The weight of everything that had happened felt like it was finally starting to settle in Sarah's chest. She had stumbled into a web of deceit, corruption, and power that she couldn't have imagined. And though she didn't yet know all the answers, she knew this much: she had just begun to scratch the surface.